Good morning. Our reading today is from Samuel chapter 19, 1 and 2. Saul tries to kill David. Saul told his son Jonathan and all of the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there." Our second reading is from Samuel chapter 24, 1 to 22. David spares Samuel's life. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" Then David crept up and noticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master and the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul, and Saul left the cave and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face in the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord gave you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed.' See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you, as the old saying goes, 'From evildoers come evil deeds.' So my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the King of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand." When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord gave me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let go away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand." Thanks be to God.
Hi everyone. Today we continue looking at David and Saul, especially David, and today we're concentrating on David the hunted, because he was hunted by Saul. Now I hope that you will notice what is happening with regard to relationships. This is important, and the responsibility that comes with having various relationships, whether it's with God himself or with other people. Now, we've heard that David was the youngest son of his father Jesse. Perhaps too young to go to war with his brothers, he stayed at home looking after the sheep. But God had big plans for David because he knew his heart and he knew his potential. Now, we've heard how Jesse sends him off to check on his brothers on the battlefield. And David, while he's there, his response to the mocking voice of the giant Goliath. Now, the result of that encounter obviously catches the attention of Saul. And eventually, David is drafted into Saul's service. But, notice, not as a warrior, but as a musician playing his harp to soothe the tormented mind of Saul, who had been rejected by God and was plagued by an evil spirit that tormented him. David was actually a relation of Saul by marriage at this point, because Saul had given him the hand of his daughter Michal in marriage as part of the reward for killing Goliath. David then was Saul's son-in-law. Now, David became very popular at court and with the fighting men, and proved himself to be an apt leader, which incidentally upset Saul, made him jealous. And on occasions, in fits of madness, to which he occasionally succumbed to, he hurled his spear at David. Now, David was a man of God and did his best not to retaliate in kind, but he kept his distance from Saul. And he actually struck up a very strong relationship with Saul's son, Jonathan. They were very close and watched out for each other. We also see in this story the prophet Samuel. He is active in this story, and he's sent by God to anoint David as Saul's successor to the throne. Now, Saul isn't removed from his position as king at that time, and David knows eventually he will have that role. He doesn't spread it around, he doesn't boast about it. But Jonathan knows about it, and I guess that maybe some others also knew that David was a future king in waiting. And as you read this story, you get the impression that David is having a really hard time under Saul. And whatever David does, Saul sees it as a threat to his own position. Saul knew that he had been rejected by God because Samuel had told him so after his disobedience over a sacrifice that he was forbidden to do. So I think it must have been obvious to him that David would be his successor to the throne. It strikes me that what we have here are two men who have both been anointed by God to lead the Israelites. But their attitudes couldn't be more different. Saul felt threatened by this young man who obviously had the Spirit of God on him. And Saul himself had had the Spirit of God removed from him, and he knew it. What was Saul to do? Now perhaps he foolishly thought that by killing and removing David, he would regain his former position. But let me ask you, can you remove someone that God has anointed and appointed? Can you defeat God's plans? Can anyone? David's life in the court of King Saul was being made intolerable. And in the first 2 verses of chapter 19 that we've read, Saul makes his intention known that he wants David killed. And things go from bad to worse, with Saul even slaying the priests of the Lord in his madness. And David is on the run. He has to leave. But he's also accompanied by some fighting men who are loyal to him. And David has to seek out strongholds in the deserts and in the hills and the mountains around about, determined to keep out of Saul's reach, but also determined not to retaliate and to do harm to the Lord's anointed, as David calls him. David has also been anointed to replace King Saul, but notice that David was not about to precipitate that by trying to kill him. In fact, he does the opposite by keeping away from him, except God's plans take effect, except that Saul, unwittingly, when hunting down David, comes to him in a most vulnerable way, and is indeed totally vulnerable, as he relieves himself in a cave where David and his men are hiding. You can't make this stuff up, can you? Now, despite his men urging him to finish Saul off, which he could have done, David sneaks up and cuts out a corner of his robe, which Saul has thrown aside. But David quickly regrets this action, and he rebukes his men because he sees it as an action that could be interpreted as saying, "See what I can do to you if I wanted to," which was not the real position that he was holding. He realised that what he really wanted was not to take things into his own hands, but to wait upon God and follow his will and his purposes. This is a powerful statement to each and every one of us. How often have you been impatient with God when waiting on him in prayer? Looking for that answer that you have determined that it should be this way, because you can't see that it could be another way. God's way, in God's time. I can relate to that. Can you? As this story progresses, we will see that David has to wait a long time before God's purposes are fulfilled for him. And Saul is killed in battle and David takes the throne. But stepping back to the incident at the cave, as Saul's army are about to turn away and leave, David appears and calls to Saul. Can you imagine for a moment this being shown as a film? It would be a really powerful moment as David appears out of the darkened cave mouth. What would happen now? David on his own before a huge army. Actually, this is God's moment. It's not Saul's or David's, it's God's moment. And this surprise puts the whole army on the back foot. including Saul. Now David has his moment and prostrates himself before his enemy. And David refers to Saul as my father. Well, he was his father-in-law after all. He's holding the piece of cloth from Saul's robe in his hand. And at that point he submits himself totally to the mercy of Saul, calling him the Lord's anointed and my master. Not only is the wind taken out of Saul's sails, but he's struck by remorse and refers to David as being more righteous than himself. Saul weeps before the whole assembled army over David and his own unjust actions, and having made an attempt then at a pact with his successor, with David, for the future of his descendants, Saul returns home with his men. But I said that God was with David, and this showed because he was given wisdom. He didn't follow him. He didn't follow him. He returned to his stronghold. He knew Saul's remorse was only temporary. It wasn't real repentance. David knew it. Now, it's possible to read this story and think of David as being emotionally strong and all held together, the wonderful leader, all the men following him, doing what he says. But you only need to read some of the Psalms that David penned during these times of being hunted, showing that he was at times very frightened for his life. He thought it was all over. And at times very angry with his lot from God. Because you might think that being anointed by God for such a fantastic role, to be a king, would be a bed of roses. Wow, fantastic. But actually it wasn't so. And the answer to that, I think, was that he was being trained by God for a very important task, which actually would challenge every fibre of his being. He wasn't perfect, and he sinned greatly, as we will see later on. But one thing in his favour, he did have a sensitive and compliant heart that quickly turned back to the God that he served and loved. It's all about relationships with God, with the people that God puts us with to do his will. And that's important. We need to think about that. We would do well to think on about why we are here and with the people that we're working with, we're living with, we're serving with. We actually don't get to choose them. Where God has placed us, and look into him to follow after him in everything as he teaches and leads us in his paths of righteousness for his name's sake. For his name's sake. You might like to join together and read this Psalm of David. I found this one looking through the Psalms the other day, and it was entitled, When He Was in the Cave, a Prayer. Perhaps it was another cave, but it may well have been this cave. And this is Psalm 142, verses 1 to 7. God bless you as you read it. Amen.